Mr. Richard Holloway was 63 years old and had been a gravedigger since the age of 30. He was a quiet, methodical man, one of those who repeated every movement with almost mathematical precision. Every morning, upon arriving at the St. Andrew Cemetery on the outskirts of Prescott, Arizona, he followed the same routine, unlocked the gate padlock, adjusted his cap, prepared a bleach bucket for the oldest graves, and made a quick round through the newer section. But that Monday, for reasons he couldn't explain, he took a different path. The sky was cloaked with thick clouds, the kind that hold back the rain but darken everything. A thin mist hung low, just enough to blur the outlines of crosses in the distance. Instead of heading straight to the chapel, Richard veered off toward the oldest section of the cemetery, a part that hadn't seen visitors in years. Something felt off in the air. It didn't smell like damp earth or flowers, as it usually did. There was a different scent, almost metallic. He walked slowly between worn-out tombstones and rusted iron crosses. When he reached the fourth row, he stopped in his tracks. In front of him stood a grave with a cracked concrete headstone and slightly disturbed soil. It wasn't open, but it had clearly been tampered with. His first thought was stray dogs, but the soil had been moved too precisely. There were no claw marks or tool imprints, no footprints, no sign of anyone having passed through. Crouching carefully, he examined the mound. It was slightly raised, as if something had just been buried or dug up. The name etched into the marble was faded but still legible. James Whittaker, deceased in 1940. Richard furrowed his brow. The name sounded vaguely familiar. He remembered faintly an old woman visiting years ago, placing a candle and whispering that James had died alone, with no one to pray for him. A faint wind blew, and the brittle branches of a nearby tree creaked. Something tightened in his chest. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was more subtle, like a warning brushing along his spine. That day, without knowing it, Richard Holloway had opened a door he was never meant to touch. And if you're someone who's drawn to the stories few dare to speak aloud, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments, what's been your most unsettling experience in life? Here, we share what others choose to bury in silence. But what Richard stumbled upon that morning was merely the first step into a silence far deeper, one that even time cannot shatter. Richard wasn't easily shaken. In over 3 decades working among the dead, he had seen it all. Families collapsing in grief over freshly dug graves, poorly prepared bodies arriving in the middle of the night, long vigils by candlelight during power outages. But that disturbed grave, untouched by human hands, gnawed at him. He returned to the shed by the main gate, brow furrowed, his steps quick. There, he found Mr. Marvin Clark, the site supervisor, making coffee. Richard recounted what he'd seen, without drama, but with a serious tone. "You went back to the old section?" Marvin asked, without looking up, as if he'd been expecting it. "I did. Something strange is going on. You better come take a look," Richard replied, pulling on his jacket. They walked silently to the forgotten part of the cemetery. When they arrived, the mound of earth was just as Richard had left it. But something else had changed, something he hadn't noticed before. The name James Whittaker had been partially scratched out, not by erosion or time. Someone had gouged it deliberately with something sharp. The marks were fresh, some letters nearly illegible, as if someone wanted that name erased from the realm of the living. Marvin knelt slowly, ran his fingers along the stone, then recoiled. "This isn't weathering. Someone used a blade or a key." "You're sure there were no tracks?" he murmured. Richard shook his head. The grass hadn't been trampled. Dry leaves lay undisturbed. Even the rusted iron cross leaning to one side appeared untouched. "What about the gates?" Marvin asked. "Still locked, padlocked. No one came in," Richard replied. The wind picked up again, this time stronger. A dry gust lifted dust and withered leaves. The creaking of branches turned harsher, as if the sound came from inside the stone itself. Richard felt a tingling at the base of his neck. He turned his head slowly. Nothing. But the air had changed. A pressure now hung over them, sinking from skull to shoulders. This name was scratched out in anger, Marvin muttered in a lower voice, like someone didn't want it remembered. Richard said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the oval portrait of James. It had a crack on one edge. Something in the expression, faded with time, seemed different. The gaze, once vacant, now felt as if it were following him. They walked back in silence. The return felt longer, not in distance, but in weight. Richard didn't yet realize that the scratched-out name was only the first piece of a puzzle no one wished to complete. The next morning, Richard arrived even earlier. He hadn't slept well. Not from fear exactly, but from a restlessness that had made him pace around his home, check the locks twice, and avoid looking out the dark windows. As soon as the clock struck 6, he was already at the cemetery gate. He headed straight to the old section, needing to confirm if the soil was still disturbed, or if he had overreacted. James Whittaker's grave looked exactly as it had the day before, but something new caught his eye. Beside the mound, partially hidden under loose soil, protruded the neck of a glass bottle. He knelt carefully and pulled it out with his hands. Inside was a withered flower, completely decayed, its petals brittle and blackened. The inside of the glass was fogged, as if it had been sealed recently. Richard turned it over. No label, no inscription, no symbol, nothing to explain its presence. A sudden crack behind him made him stand up sharply. It was a dry snap, like a stone falling or a branch snapping. He looked around. The cemetery was empty. No wind, no birds, no strays. The sound didn't repeat. He stepped back slowly, eyes still on the grave, as if expecting something to rise from it. He wrapped the bottle in a rag, placed it in a bag, and returned to the shed to find Marvin. This time, he couldn't keep it to himself. Marvin's face paled as he entered. Richard barely had to speak. As soon as he showed the bottle, Marvin inhaled sharply and removed his cap. "Where'd you find that?" "Next to the mound." "It wasn't there yesterday," Richard answered. "That's not an offering. No one leaves something like that. That flower, it's recently dead. Real recent." Richard stayed quiet. Marvin pulled a rosary from his pocket, gripped it tightly, and muttered, "That wasn't left by someone living." Together they returned to the grave. The place felt darker than it had just hours earlier. The air was heavy, pressing down on their shoulders like an unseen weight. They watched in silence for minutes, waiting for something to change. Then, the same dry, cracking sound echoed again, now just a few feet away. Richard spun around. Nothing. Only moss-covered headstones and stretched shadows. "Let's go," Marvin said. They walked back without another word. At the shed, Richard placed the bottle on a wooden shelf. The flower inside looked even more shriveled. He stared at it for a moment before locking the door behind him. That night, something shifted inside him. For the first time in his life, Richard felt he was confronting something he couldn't explain, and that whatever it was, it had been waiting for him. After a sleepless night of tossing and turning, Richard arrived at the cemetery with his mind made up. Watching wasn't enough anymore, nor was guessing. He needed something concrete, something official. Instead of heading to the old sector like the days before, he walked directly to the administrative office, where the keys to the underground archive were kept. A damp, dark room beneath the main building, where burial records had been stored since the early 1900s. Marvin was already there, sorting through documents with a tired look in his eyes. When he saw Richard walk in, he instantly knew something was pressing. "You want to go down there?" he asked bluntly. "I do. I need to check the year 1940. I want to know who that James Whittaker really was." Marvin didn't argue. He handed him a flashlight and a ring of old keys, and together they descended the concrete staircase. As they opened the rusted iron door, the smell of mildew and aged paper wrapped around them. Richard, used to the scent of dry flowers and earth, found this air heavier, like something hung unseen in every corner. They searched among shelves stacked with thick, leather-bound books. After 15 minutes, they found the burial registry for 1940. The handwritten script from that era remained clear and deliberate. They turned the pages one by one until, nestled between entries for deaths from typhoid and farming accidents, they found it. Whitaker James. Deceased July 3rd, 1940. Interred same day. But it was the observation column that stopped their breath. Buried without ceremony. No family present. Burial order issued by local authorities. Procedure authorized without autopsy. Marvin read in silence, then muttered, "That wasn't normal, even back then." Richard kept reading. At the bottom of the page, almost like a footnote, a pale, trembling, handwritten note appeared. "This grave must remain sealed. Do not open under any circumstances. Review pending. Danger." The page was yellowed, and the note seemed written by someone who had no time left for explanations. A final attempt to leave a warning. "Review pending," Richard whispered. Marvin slowly closed the book. Neither said another word. Both men felt they were no longer alone in that archive. The silence wasn't complete. It was thick, as if another breath, invisible and waiting, was layered with theirs. They left without looking back, their steps slower than usual. Emerging into the grayish morning light, the world outside felt somehow less real. Richard knew he couldn't unsee what he'd read. And for the first time he began to think that the name scratched from the headstone hadn't been removed out of hatred, but as a warning. The next morning dawned beneath a weak sun filtered through high, thin clouds. Despite the exhaustion, Richard showed up early. He brought no tools, no bucket, no broom, only a small flashlight in his pocket and a notebook where he had started recording every strange event since he noticed the disturbed grave. He had stopped trusting his memory alone. He went straight to the old section. The air there felt different, as if time moved more slowly between those graves. When he reached James Whitaker's tomb, he froze. Not because of anything grotesque, but due to a subtle difference that, once noticed, couldn't be unseen. The small oval photo that had always been in the upper right corner of the headstone now sat at the bottom left. Richard approached slowly, inspecting the marble surface. The area where the photo had once been still bore the outline of aged adhesive, rust lines, and a grayish shadow. There were no signs it had been torn off, and in its new position, the image looked untouched, as if it had always been there. He took a deep breath, leaned in, and touched the photograph. It was cold, colder than normal, even for a cool morning. At that moment, a faint vibration ran through his fingers. It was so subtle he almost doubted it, but strong enough to make him pull his hand away. The face of James, blurred by time, now seemed slightly clearer. The once blank expression was different. The eyes, once empty, now seemed to follow him. Richard couldn't take it anymore. He returned to the shed and found Marvin just arriving with a thermos of coffee. Without saying a word, he led him to the grave. When they got there, Marvin froze. He frowned, staring at the photo and then the stone. "That's impossible," he murmured, crossing himself. "There's no sign it was removed," Richard added. "It's like it just moved." Marvin didn't respond. He scanned the area, as if expecting someone to be watching from behind a tree or a headstone. Nothing. The cemetery was as empty as it always was at that hour, but the atmosphere had changed. Both men knew something was shifting. "Let's leave it for today," Marvin finally said. "Don't come back here alone." Richard nodded. That afternoon, while locking up the shed, he glanced toward the old section. The wind was blowing in a single direction, but in that corner, the leaves floated aimlessly. What unsettled him most now wasn't what he saw. It was what he had begun to feel. A silent, patient presence, like something or someone had noticed he was paying too much attention. That night, Richard tried to keep to his routine. He brewed a pot of strong coffee, sat in his favorite chair, and turned on the radio to listen to old jazz standards, just as he had done every evening for years. But something was off. The atmosphere in his home felt different, like a chill had seeped into the walls. It wasn't the weather. It wasn't particularly cold outside. It was something else. A tense stillness, as if the air itself were watching. At 10, while flipping through a worn-out book of local town chronicles, he heard a low sound. It came from the hallway connecting the kitchen to the back porch. He froze. At first, he thought it was the dog, but he'd locked the dog in the laundry room since the animal had been restless all afternoon. Then he assumed it might be a draft. But no, it was a voice. Richard. It wasn't a whisper or a shout. It was a clear voice, calm and unhurried, as if someone were calling him from the end of the hall. He stood slowly, leaving his half-full cup on the table. He walked to the hallway door and flipped the light switch. Nothing. Everything in its place. He checked the porch, looked behind the kitchen curtain, even stepped out into the backyard. Silent. Absolute. Back inside, he found he couldn't sit again. His nerves were shot. It wasn't just what he heard, it was that his body had already sensed it coming. His dog, who he usually ignored when it barked for no reason, was now curled under the table, whining softly, eyes fixed on the closed window. At 2 in the morning, while trying to sleep, he heard the voice again. Closer, more certain. It called his name once more, as if it had known him his entire life. Richard shot upright, turned on the light, but he was alone. His breath was ragged, his shirt drenched in cold sweat. The next day, overwhelmed by tension, he decided to speak with his son, Michael. He didn't tell him everything, but explained that something strange was happening, at the cemetery and at home. Michael, though skeptical, agreed to go with him. He knew his father well and understood he wasn't one to imagine things or fall into superstition. That afternoon, as they arrived at the cemetery, the air felt heavier than usual. Michael noticed it right away, but said nothing. They walked together to the old sector in complete silence. Richard had no clear plan. He only knew he couldn't face this alone anymore. And if there was any logic, any pattern to what was happening, someone else had to see it, feel it, confirm it, because the line between what was real and what wasn't was starting to blur. And though he didn't know it yet, what they would find near James Whittaker's grave would be the clearest proof that some things don't want to be seen, yet still allow themselves to be found. Michael, used to seeing his father as a steady, unshakable man, noticed the difference right away. Not just in his speech, slower, more cautious, but in the way he looked around, as if expecting something behind every gravestone. Despite not believing in anything beyond this world, Michael decided not to judge. He knew his father wasn't one to invent stories, and that alone was reason enough to pay attention. They walked to the same spot as in previous days. James Whittaker's grave was still there, and although everything appeared unchanged at first glance, Michael noticed the soil around it had once again been disturbed. Richard didn't seem surprised. "The earth shouldn't be like this. There's been no rain, no visitors. It makes no sense," he said quietly. Michael knelt to touch it. It was damp. No footprints, no tools, no signs of animals digging. Something didn't add up. Then Richard noticed something else. "Look at the photo," he said, pointing to the stone. The small oval image, which had already moved once, was now gone entirely. Only traces of dry adhesive remained in one corner. The absence was undeniable, as if someone had removed it carefully overnight. A knot formed in Richard's stomach. He said nothing more. He sat on a nearby stone bench, breathing heavily. Michael stood, surveying the surroundings. Then he saw it. About 30 feet away, at the base of a twisted ancient tree, a figure moved among the shadows. It didn't run. It didn't vanish. It simply glided silently, almost as if floating. Michael tried to focus, but the figure disappeared the moment he tried to look directly at it. "Dad, I think I saw someone over there," he whispered, frozen in place. Richard stood up abruptly, scanning where his son pointed, but saw nothing. The place looked the same. Old graves, dry trees, and that wind that always seemed to blow only in that corner of the cemetery. And then, without warning, they both heard the voice. Richard. It wasn't a scream. It was the same steady, deliberate voice Richard had heard in his home, without echo, without urgency. Michael heard it too, loud and clear. They stared at each other in silence, eyes wide. No one was visible, no movement. No logic could explain what had just occurred. "You heard that?" Richard asked. Michael only nodded. Whatever was happening was no longer just his father's perception. It was real. Both knew it. They said nothing else. They walked back the same way they'd come. As they left, Richard felt eyes following him from somewhere among the headstones. There was no way to know if it was just his imagination, but the silence behind them felt too present, too heavy, and that voice, now confirmed, wasn't going to leave them alone so easily. The next morning, Richard picked Michael up early. He didn't say much over the phone, just that he needed to go back to the cemetery. One more time, but this time, not just to observe. He came prepared, a new flashlight, his old battery-powered radio, and his phone fully charged. If anything strange happened again, he'd document it. Not to convince anyone, just to prove to himself he wasn't losing his mind. The weather had shifted. The sky, once overcast and dull, was now clear. Yet the air felt denser than ever, as if the atmosphere itself sensed something was out of place. Michael, quieter than usual, walked beside him in silence. As they reached the old section, they saw right away that James Whitaker's grave looked exactly the same, disturbingly altered. Once again, the soil appeared freshly turned, as if someone had carefully dug and filled it back in. No footprints, no trash, no signs of animals, no sign of humans. Richard pulled the radio from his backpack and placed it on a nearby headstone. It was off. He began slowly walking around the mound, while Michael scanned the surroundings. The air smelled different, a mix of moisture and something else. Something metallic, like rust. Then, without anyone touching it, the radio turned on. A burst of static blared out, followed by irregular noise. At first it was just interference, but then came fragments of voices, not clear ones. It was as if several people were speaking at once from far-off places. No full sentences, just broken, scattered phrases buried in white noise. Michael stepped closer, startled. Richard said nothing, but pointed his flashlight toward the base of the grave. There, tucked into a corner where nothing had been before, lay a small white stone. It had been placed carefully, deliberately, like someone had set it there earlier that morning. It was etched by hand. He bent down to read it. "Do not dig." The letters were thin, crooked, almost as if carved with a fingernail or a rusty nail. The stone was clean, no moss, no wear, fresh. Michael felt the hair on his arms stand on end. "Who would leave this?" he murmured. Before Richard could answer, the radio screeched with a piercing sound, almost like a human scream, so loud they both covered their ears, and in that moment the voice returned. "Richard, no." The sound stopped instantly. What followed was a silence so complete it felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. Michael, pale, looked at his father. Richard stood still, stone in one hand, flashlight trembling in the other. They had crossed a line. Whatever inhabited that place now knew they knew, and it didn't seem to want to stay hidden anymore. They left the cemetery without a word, but just before crossing the gate, they both felt it. Something breathing out the softest whisper, clear as glass. "Help me." That night, Richard didn't speak to anyone. Michael, though he drove his father home, left without saying much. Both men knew something had changed. What they'd experienced wasn't coincidence. It wasn't suggestion. But it wasn't just fear now. It was deeper, harder to name, a silent urgency, as if something were waiting for a decision to be made. At dawn, Richard rose without hunger. without coffee, without his routine, only with the certainty that he had to return, one last time, not to find answers, but to understand whether there was any way to close whatever had been opened. He took only a flashlight, no radio, no phone, no company. He knew Michael wouldn't allow it, so he didn't tell him. This wasn't about bravery. It was about respect. The sky was pale grey, but not threatening. As he arrived at the cemetery, everything looked the same, yet different. Dry leaves crunched under his boots, though there was no wind. The headstones looked older, more warped. The silence was complete, but it wasn't peace. It was a silence that held something inside. He walked calmly to James Whittaker's grave. From a distance, it looked untouched. The soil was firm, even, no markings. The photo that had disappeared was still gone. So was the white warning stone and the glass bottle. Nothing remained. It was as if all the strangeness had pulled back at once, leaving only a forgotten grave among many. Richard stood before it and did nothing. He didn't search. He didn't move. He just observed. Minutes passed. The wind didn't blow. The trees didn't sway. And yet, there was something in the air. A soft tension, sensed rather than seen. He stared at the headstone. The name, still partially scratched out, remained. The carved marks were fainter now, as if time itself was slowly sealing them. Richard felt a sharp pang in his chest. Not pain, but certainty. He understood then, without anyone saying it. It wasn't his duty to fix anything. There was nothing to fix. He only had to accept that some things exist beyond reason that don't wish to be seen. And when they make themselves known, they don't seek explanations, only witnesses. He took a deep breath and sat on a nearby bench. For the first time in days, he felt no fear. Not peace either. Just the sense that something had let him go. As if that corner of the cemetery no longer watched him. He stayed there, in perfect silence, until the sun finally broke through the clouds. A soft breeze brushed his face. Nothing more. When he rose, he allowed himself one last glance at the grave. Nothing had changed, but he knew absolutely that what he needed to see, he had seen. And what he needed to hear had been said. It was time to leave. From that final day at St. Andrew's Cemetery, Richard Holloway never returned to the old section. He never spoke James Whittaker's name again, not out of fear, but because he had made a quiet decision not to disturb what, in his eyes, had found a kind of rest. He took a job as groundskeeper at a small rural school, where the only graves he saw were crayon drawings on hallway walls. Michael, for his part, never spoke of what he had witnessed. If someone asked why he no longer visited his father on Sunday afternoons, he answered vaguely. No one knew the secret they now carried, one that had quietly reshaped both their lives. Marvin retired shortly afterward. As he signed his retirement papers, he was heard muttering under his breath, "Some things aren't meant to be looked at twice." No one knew what he meant, and no one asked. James's grave is still there, seemingly undisturbed. No flowers, no visitors. New cemetery workers tend to avoid that area without knowing exactly why. Some claim birds don't fly over that patch of land. Others say the grass there never grows quite right. No one's confirmed it, but no one's eager to try. Richard still keeps the notebook where he wrote everything. It's tucked inside a wooden box, along with a prayer card of St. Michael and a rusted key he never figured out the origin of. He has no intention of showing it to anyone. He doesn't seek attention. He just needs to remember that it was real, that it wasn't a dream or madness, because it was real. There were no ghosts floating, no figures rising from the soil, no voices shattering glass or bodies dragged across floors. It was something more subtle, deeper, something that lingers at the edge of logic, hiding in the silent corners of daily life until someone sees it, until someone hears it, and once that happens, there's no turning back. These days, Richard walks the school halls with the same calm as always. He greets teachers, tidies tools, waters the plants, No one would guess that deep inside, there's a sealed corner filled with things that can't be explained or repeated. A space made of voices, of eyes staring out from broken portraits, of soil disturbed without footprints, of stones that warn without speaking. He knows some stories aren't meant to be told aloud, and especially not repeated. He knows that some names once scratched out are never to be spoken again. And he understands, because he learned it late, but he learned it, that in some places, the only wise thing to do is leave. Quietly, without looking back. Because some things are never meant to be touched, and what sleeps must be left sleeping.